When Jenna and I left Minnesota for the wide open spaces of northern Montana, we weren't running from anything. We just needed a change. More space, more quiet, and more time together. I've worked construction and carpentry since I was 19, and with the rising demand for work in rural builds, moving west just made sense. Jenna hadn't worked since her tech job went remote and fizzled out, so she was happy to follow wherever life led us. We found a house outside a little place called Cobalt Creek. It wasn't on any major maps, just a winding road, and maybe a dozen farms dotted around the valley. The farmhouse was old, 3 stories if you counted the attic, and set on 10 acres of grassland bordered by pine forest. The price was right, almost too right, but we chalked it up to a rural discount and jumped on the opportunity. The house had a massive basement, which the realtor barely mentioned. I just said, unfinished, good bones. I peeked at it briefly during our first walkthrough. Dark, cold, concrete, and didn't think twice. We were far more interested in the workshop out back, the stone fireplace, and the view of the mountains. For the first couple of months, everything was peaceful. I spent my days taking odd construction jobs around the region, while Jenna tried her hand at gardening and getting to know the few neighbors we had. We had our dog, Bowie, a yellow shepherd mutt, and the kind of quiet we'd only dreamed of. But sometime around the 10th week, I noticed something strange. The hallway lights upstairs kept flickering. Then, randomly, the breaker would trip, but only for the upstairs. The rest of the house was fine. I didn't think much of it at first. Old house, old wiring. But eventually, I figured I'd head down to the basement and fix it properly. I remember telling Jenna, "Gonna fix that breaker once and for all." She laughed and said, "Maybe while you're down there, clean up a little. It gives me the creeps." She wasn't wrong. The place was a mess. Stacks of boxes left by the previous owner, rusted tools, broken chairs, and even an old mattress. I made my way through the clutter with a flashlight and found the main breaker mounted on a wooden panel. I adjusted the load between 2 circuits and thought I'd solved it. But as I was heading back upstairs, something caught my eye. In the far corner of the basement, behind a rotting armoire and a half-collapsed shelf, was a metal hatch. Not a regular door. This thing looked like it belonged in a bank. Matte black, with a reinforced handle and riveted hinges. It was almost flush with the wall, like someone had built around it to hide it. Curiosity kicked in. I tugged at the handle. It was locked tight. No keypad, just an old-fashioned keyhole. I went upstairs and rummaged through a jar of keys the previous owner had left behind, but none fit. That night, over dinner, I told Jenna about it. Her fork stopped mid-air. "What kind of door?" "Like a vault. Dead serious. We missed it before, but it's down there. Sealed shut." Jenna blinked slowly, then shrugged. Creepy, but probably nothing. That explanation didn't sit well with me. Why install a vault in a farmhouse? And more importantly, why not mention it? The next day, I tracked down the seller's phone number from our paperwork. A woman named Nancy answered after 3 rings. I told her who I was and asked about the locked hatch in the basement. There was a long pause. Then she said, "I wouldn't mess with that." Her tone was flat. Not fearful, just resigned. I asked again, pressing her for details. She dodged, said it was just an old storm room, and claimed they had lost the key years ago. She told me, best to leave it alone. It's not hurting anyone. She hung up right after. Jenna tried to rationalize it. Maybe they're just embarrassed. Could be nothing but junk behind there. But I couldn't let it go. A week passed, and every night I thought about that door. What was behind it? Why hide it? I finally caved and called in a locksmith. His name was Clyde, an older guy with long white hair and a denim jacket. When I showed him the door, he whistled. "This ain't your average padlock," he said. "Someone didn't want this opened. It took him nearly 2 hours, but he finally cracked it. The lock gave with a metallic snap, and the door creaked open. I wish I could say there was gold, or paperwork, or tools, anything remotely logical. But what we found was wrong. The room was about 12 feet wide, lit only by a grimy bulb in the ceiling. The walls were lined with old photographs, black and white portraits, mostly of people. But their faces were scratched out, each one marked with red ink symbols I didn't recognize. The whole place smelled like stale air and rotting paper. In the center was a plain wooden chair facing a bare wall. A small altar stood behind it, stacked with burned candles. Bones, real ones, I think, and bundles of dried flowers. To the left was a cot, its blanket crumpled and stained. On the floor beside it, food wrappers, plastic water bottles, and an old radio. Someone had been living there recently. I backed out of the room and stared at Jenna, who had just come down to see the storm room for herself. "Jesus Christ," she whispered. "What the hell is this?" Then I noticed the other door. It was small, maybe 5 feet high, nearly hidden behind a hanging tarp. I pushed it open and found a narrow staircase. At the top was a rusted metal latch, and when I opened it, I found myself behind our shed, a hidden entrance. I realized, horrified, that someone had access to our house from the outside all along. We called the police. They came out, took statements, and photographed everything. But with no fingerprints, no footage, and no idea who had lived there, there wasn't much they could do. They said they'd try to get in touch with the previous owners again, but warned us it might take time. That night, we didn't sleep. I pushed the sofa against the front door. Jenna kept the bedroom light on. Bowie barked at every creak in the walls. Around 2 a.m., someone banged on the front door. 3 quick, violent knocks. Bowie lost it. Jenna screamed. I ran to the door with a crowbar but didn't open it. The banging stopped. Then came the tapping. Light clicks against our bedroom window. When I peeked out through the blinds, I saw them. 2 figures, tall and motionless, stood by the tree line. White masks, hooded jackets. One of them raised a hand, slowly, and waved. I called 911 again. The police arrived 15 minutes later. The figures were gone. No tracks, no evidence, nothing. The next morning, I went to the back and found the shed door open. The hatch was shut, thank God, but I reinforced it with screws and chained it shut from the inside. We cleaned out the shrine room and locked it with my own padlock, 2 in fact. But the fear didn't leave. A few nights later, another knock came, this time at the back door. Then a window shattered in the kitchen. I chased the intruders with a bat, but saw only shadows fleeing into the forest. We called the police again. They told us it could be local squatters or cultists. We didn't care anymore. We just wanted to feel safe. Since then, we haven't had another incident. Maybe the police scared them off. Maybe they moved on. But that hatch still sits in our basement, and I still check the cameras every night before I sleep. We live here, but it doesn't feel like home. Not anymore. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, please consider subscribing to our channel and clicking the bell icon so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Your support truly encourages us and helps this channel continue to grow. And don't forget to share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. I had just turned 32 when I bought my first home in a quiet neighborhood just outside Eugene, Oregon. It was the first time I'd ever lived alone. Before this, I'd spent most of my adult life bouncing between roommates and cramped apartments. So when the opportunity came to own my own space, just a modest 2-bedroom house with a rooftop patio, I jumped at it. The adjustment was tougher than I thought. I always figured I liked peace and quiet, but living alone was a kind of silence I wasn't used to. No footsteps above me, no TV down the hall, no kitchen clatter to lull me to sleep. Just stillness. Too much stillness. One thing I grew to appreciate quickly was the tiny rooftop patio connected to my bedroom. It wasn't anything fancy. Technically, it was part of the flat roof, with a railing installed for safety. There was just enough room for a small bench and a potted plant or two. I used it as my evening retreat, mostly to have a cigarette or two before bed. I don't like smoking indoors, and being able to step outside without going downstairs felt like a luxury. It was from this perch that I first started to notice something strange. My house backed up against another row of homes, typical suburban development. All the properties were separated by tall wooden fences, but from the rooftop, I could see over the fence into the neighbor's backyard behind mine. At first, I didn't think much of it. The place looked run down, but not abandoned. Still, in all the days and nights I sat on my rooftop patio, I never saw anyone in that yard. No lights flicked on, no one tending the lawn, no cars in the driveway. The grass was knee-high, and the windows stayed dark. It was eerie. One weekend, I decided to walk around the block and see if anyone actually lived there. I figured I'd knock, maybe introduce myself. It's good to know your neighbors after all. The house was worse up close. Paint peeling off the siding, porch sagging in the middle, shutters barely hanging on. I climbed the steps and knocked. No answer. I waited, knocked again. I was about to leave when I saw the curtain shift slightly in the front window. Someone was in there. I hesitated, then knocked one more time. After a moment, the door opened. Standing there was an older man with a white beard, paper-thin skin, and thick glasses perched on a crooked nose. His clothes were wrinkled and stained. His eyes, however, were intense, wide open, unblinking, staring directly into mine. "Hi," I said awkwardly. "I'm Andrew. I just moved in behind you." The man didn't say a word. He just kept staring. "I thought I'd come introduce myself," I offered. Finally, in a raspy voice, he said, "William." Then he shut the door. I stood there for a beat, dumbfounded, before walking away. The whole thing had left a bad taste in my mouth. He didn't seem threatening exactly, just off. Something about his eyes didn't sit right with me. That night, I went back out onto my rooftop for a smoke. As I leaned against the railing, I instinctively glanced toward the backyard behind mine. William was there. He stood in the middle of the overgrown lawn, facing my house, arms at his sides. He didn't wave, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. I stepped back slowly, heart pounding. I didn't want to overreact. Maybe he was just checking out his own yard. Maybe he didn't even see me. But when I ducked behind the railing and peeked out again, he hadn't moved. I went inside and locked the door. For the next few nights, I kept the curtains closed and avoided the rooftop. But my curiosity, and a bit of defiance, got the better of me. On the fifth night, I stepped out just to see. He was at his window now. The curtain barely cracked open, just enough for me to catch a glint of his glasses in the light. Watching me again, I stared back. He didn't move, he didn't blink. I went back inside, shaken. Things escalated quickly after that. I'd catch glimpses of him through the fence slats during the day, lurking near the edge of his yard. Once, I saw him crouch down, hands in the dirt. When I blinked, he was gone. A few mornings later, I found an old slipper in my backyard. Faded blue, size small, women's. I didn't own anything like that. I tossed it in the trash and tried not to think about it. But the worst came a week later. It was almost midnight when my doorbell started ringing. Not once or twice, over and over, fast and frantic. I jumped up, heart in my throat. I looked through the peephole and felt my stomach drop. It was William. He was wearing a stained robe and holding something metallic in his hand. A wrench. He was muttering something, pacing in place, ringing the bell again and again. I should have called the police right then, but I was tired. I was angry. I just wanted it to stop. I opened the door an inch, chain still on. "William, what the hell are you doing?" He lunged forward, smashing the wrench into the door. The chain held, but just barely. His voice rose to a shout, slurred words about how I stole her and took her from him. I slammed the door and called the cops. He didn't stop yelling until the sirens arrived. When they led him away, he was still ranting, spittle flying, wrench clutched in his hand like a lifeline. One officer stayed behind to talk. Apparently, William had a history. He'd lived there for decades, alone after his wife died. Early onset dementia, occasional violent episodes. The neighbors had tried to help at first, but eventually gave up. I asked if he'd be coming back. The cop just shrugged. He'll be in psychiatric evaluation for a while. Can't say for sure. That night, I didn't sleep. Even with the locks, even with the lights on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A month later, I put the house up for sale. I loved that rooftop patio, but I never set foot on it again. We moved to Waverly Hollow in early autumn, just after our second daughter was born. My wife, Emily, and I were desperate for more space after years of living in an apartment in downtown Pittsburgh. The chaos of raising kids in a 2-bedroom unit surrounded by constant city noise wore us thin. So when a cozy 2-story colonial home popped up in a quiet Pennsylvania suburb, we jumped on it. The house wasn't brand new, but it had character. Arched doorways, creaky hardwood floors, and a large, fenced backyard that Emily immediately fell in love with. What stood out most, though, were the statues. Scattered throughout the garden were 5 old stone sculptures. Most were moss-covered and cracked, depicting various figures: an angel, a hooded woman, a crouching child, and 2 others I couldn't quite identify. They looked like they had been there for decades. Emily called them romantic and said they gave the place a timeless atmosphere. I found them mildly creepy, but I kept my opinion to myself. The first week was blissfully ordinary. Boxes are unpacked, bedrooms are set up, and our toddler is running wild on the lawn. Then, on a Wednesday morning, something strange caught my eye. From the kitchen window, I noticed the angel statue was no longer facing the garden. It had turned toward the house. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if I was misremembering its position. But I was sure it had been facing the flower bed when we moved in. I mentioned it to Emily, who shrugged and said maybe one of the movers had bumped it. That made enough sense. But the next day, another statue had changed. The hooded woman, who once stood solemnly beside the maple tree, was now pointing at the back door. And the angel? It had shifted again, now aligned directly with our bedroom window. I checked for drag marks or signs that someone had moved them, but the ground beneath was undisturbed. I asked Emily again. She laughed and said maybe our toddler had done it. But these statues were heavy, easily 100 pounds each. No way a 3-year-old could budge one. By Friday, all 5 statues had subtly rotated. They now formed a semicircle, each figure gazing toward the house like a silent jury. I stood at the kitchen sink that evening and felt a chill despite the warm air. I tried to shake it off. We were stressed. Moving was exhausting. Maybe I was imagining things. Then Saturday night happened. We were tucking in the girls when Emily called me downstairs. Her voice was tight. I found her standing in the living room, pointing to the backyard window. I looked outside and froze. The statues were pressed right up against the house, perfectly lined in front of the living room windows, as if they had been arranged that way on purpose. I opened the back door and stepped outside. The air was still. The lawn was untouched. No footprints, no signs of dragging, I pushed one of them, hard. It didn't move, not an inch. Emily came out behind me. "This isn't funny," she whispered. That night, neither of us slept. The following morning, something even worse greeted us. Spray painted in thick black letters across the back wall of the house were the words, "Go away." Emily screamed. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived 20 minutes later, took a statement, and walked the property. But with no security cameras, no witnesses, and no signs of forced entry, there wasn't much they could do. "Could be teenagers," one officer said. "This kind of thing happens sometimes when a new family moves in." I didn't believe that. Who would go through the effort of moving heavy stone statues just to scare someone? We decided to take action. I went to the hardware store and bought a set of motion sensor lights for the backyard. We couldn't afford a full camera setup yet, but I figured a few bright lights would deter anyone from sneaking around. Emily, meanwhile, insisted we start sleeping with the bedroom windows locked and the curtains shut tight. For a few days, things were calm. The statues stayed put. No new messages appeared. I started to think maybe it had been a one-time thing, a messed-up prank or some weird neighborhood tradition. But Emily remained on edge. She checked the backyard obsessively, sometimes waking in the night just to peer through the blinds. And then, on the following Thursday, the lights tripped. It was around 2:30 a.m. I bolted upright in bed, blinking at the sudden brightness pouring through the curtain edges. Emily whispered, "The lights." I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, beyond the rose bush, I saw them. 5 figures, human-sized, standing perfectly still in the yard. They weren't statues. They were people, each wearing featureless white masks and pale robes that shimmered in the floodlights. They weren't moving, just staring. I backed away from the window and called 911. My voice trembled. There are people in our yard, 5 of them, wearing masks. Emily gathered the kids and locked them in the master bathroom. I stood by the front door, kitchen knife in hand, my heart pounding. Sirens wailed in the distance, but before the police arrived, the figures vanished. Gone, as if they'd melted into the earth. The officers searched the area. No footprints, no evidence of anyone even being there. But the real kicker, the statues had returned to their original spots, facing away from the house, like none of it had ever happened. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Neither did Emily. The next day, I maxed out a credit card and bought a full set of security cameras, installed them myself. 4 outside, 1 covering the hallway. That evening, I re-watched the footage from the night before. At exactly 2:31 a.m., the motion sensors flared on. But the camera feed? Static. Only for 40 seconds, just long enough for the figures to appear and vanish. I replayed it over and over, hoping to catch a glimpse, a shape, a flicker, anything. Nothing. Emily begged me to consider moving. She even called her sister in Maine and asked if we could stay with her temporarily. I said no. We'd spent everything on this house. It was ours. We weren't running from shadows. The final incident happened 3 nights later. We were asleep when a loud crash jolted us awake. I ran downstairs, flashlight in hand. The back door was wide open, the lock splintered. I swept the light across the kitchen. Nothing. Then I turned to the living room and nearly dropped the flashlight. The statues were inside. All 5 of them were arranged in a tight half-circle facing the couch. Dirt and moss littered the floor beneath them. Their stone faces were unchanged, but I swore I could feel pressure in the air, like something immense had just left the room. I screamed for Emily to grab the kids and drive to her sister's. She didn't argue. I stayed behind. With a bat and the phone in hand, I paced the house until morning. When sunlight finally filtered through the blinds, I dared to approach the statues again. They were cold, unmoving. But one of them, the crouching child, had a crack across its face that I hadn't noticed before. That afternoon, I rented a truck and loaded the statues myself. It took hours and nearly threw my back out, but I didn't stop until they were gone. I dumped them off at a salvage yard 15 miles away. The guy working there asked where they came from. I told him I didn't want them anymore. He didn't ask further. Since then, nothing has happened. We still live in Waverly Hollow. The backyard feels emptier now, but safer. The cameras haven't picked up anything strange, and the police haven't had to return. Emily still sleeps uneasily, and I find myself checking the feed every night before bed. We never found out who, or what, was behind the masked figures. But sometimes, when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear the scrape of stone against wood. And in those moments, I wonder if we ever really got rid of them. Or if they're just waiting.